Hi guys. Tonight, we drift into shadows where history sleeps and secrets whisper. Close your eyes and imagine walking through the abandoned halls of what was once the greatest library in the ancient world. Your footsteps echo against marble floors where scholars once debated the mysteries of mathematics, where physicians shared revolutionary surgical techniques, where astronomers mapped the movement of distant stars. But now there's only silence. Not the peaceful silence of rest, but the haunting quiet of deliberate erasure. This is the story they don't want you to know. A tale so profound it will reshape everything you thought you understood about human civilization. For over 1,000 years, from roughly 500 to 1500 AD, we're told that Europe experienced what historians call the Dark Ages, a period of unprecedented intellectual stagnation where humanity supposedly forgot how to think, create, and innovate. Cities crumbled, knowledge vanished, and millions of people lived in ignorance under the shadow of superstition and fear. But what if I told you this entire narrative was carefully orchestrated? What if the darkness wasn't a natural consequence of societal collapse, but the result of the most sophisticated information suppression campaign in human history? Think about this for a moment. How does an entire continent that produced minds like Plato, Euclid, and Marcus Aurelius suddenly lose the ability to read and write? How do the descendants of people who built the Pantheon and engineered complex aqueduct systems forget basic construction techniques? How do the heirs of Roman legal traditions become incapable of organizing coherent governments? The standard explanation is barbarian invasions. We're told that Germanic tribes swept across Europe, destroying everything in their path and plunging civilization into chaos. But here's what they don't mention. When these invasions occurred, one institution not only survived the collapse but actually grew stronger during the chaos: the Christian Church. While secular power structures crumbled, while libraries burned, while schools closed their doors forever, the Church emerged from the rubble as the sole inheritor of Rome's vast intellectual legacy. They became the exclusive custodians of human knowledge, the only institution capable of reading, writing, and preserving the wisdom of ages. But were they truly preserving this knowledge, or were they controlling it? Consider the mechanics of how information was transmitted in the medieval world. Every book had to be copied by hand, a process that took months or even years for a single volume. Who controlled this process? Monks. Where did they work? In monasteries under direct church authority. What did they choose to copy? Only texts that served theological purposes or supported church doctrine. This wasn't preservation, it was curation. Every classical text that survived did so because church authorities decided it deserved to survive. Works that contradicted religious teaching simply weren't copied. Ideas that challenged church authority were left to decay. Knowledge that might inspire independent thinking was quietly eliminated from circulation. The psychological implications are staggering. Imagine growing up in a world where every book, every teacher, every source of information told you the exact same story, where alternative viewpoints weren't just discouraged, they literally didn't exist because the texts containing them had been systematically excluded from reproduction. This is how you control not just what people know, but what they can imagine knowing. By eliminating competing narratives, the Church created an intellectual monopoly so complete that questioning their authority became literally unthinkable. But the plan was even more sophisticated than simple censorship. The Church didn't just hide knowledge, they created the illusion that knowledge had never existed in the first place. They constructed a historical narrative where the period before Christianity was portrayed as partially enlightened at best, and the period during church dominance was presented as humanity's gradual emergence from ignorance into divine truth. The Dark Ages weren't dark because knowledge was lost. They were dark because knowledge was deliberately hidden. And the most brilliant aspect of this deception was that it made people grateful for receiving back tiny portions of their own stolen intellectual heritage. When the Renaissance rediscovered classical learning, Europeans celebrated these revelations as proof of human progress. They never suspected they were simply being given back carefully selected fragments of knowledge that had been sitting in church archives all along. Imagine for a moment that the story of the Dark Ages is not simply one of cultural decline but one of deliberate manipulation, a carefully crafted veil over 1,000 years of intellectual control. By the early medieval period, the power vacuum left by the collapse of the Roman Empire was swiftly filled by the Church, which recognized that controlling knowledge was the foundation of true power. Across Europe, the once vibrant networks of schools, libraries, and academies that had nurtured scientific inquiry, literature, and philosophy were systematically dismantled or absorbed into monastic institutions. These monasteries became the new centers of learning, but learning was no longer free. It was tightly regulated and filtered through the rigid dogma of the Church. Monks diligently copied manuscripts, but not indiscriminately. Texts deemed heretical, scientific works that conflicted with theological teachings, and philosophical treatises questioning church authority seldom survived the scriptorium's selective process. In essence, the intellectual heritage of classical antiquity was not simply lost but was carefully curated to fit a new, orthodox worldview that served institutional power. The language barrier was another sophisticated tool of exclusion. Latin, once a versatile and accessible medium of communication throughout the Roman world, was transformed into a specialized ecclesiastical language, dense with theological terminology and complex grammatical structures that limited comprehension to a narrow sect of clergy educated within the Church's own controlled training programs. This linguistic gatekeeping meant that common people, even many nobles who had received basic education, were effectively barred from accessing the deeper wells of knowledge. Access to learning was predicated not only on explicit permission from church authorities, but on language proficiency that could only be cultivated under direct ecclesiastical supervision. Consider this chilling possibility. The Church was not merely preserving knowledge as they claimed, but was systematically suppressing innovation by tightly controlling educational curricula and ruthlessly restricting independent inquiry. Scientific methods that could have advanced medicine, agricultural techniques that could have prevented famines, and engineering principles that could have revolutionized construction were deliberately withheld, distorted, or buried in inaccessible archives. Meanwhile, the broader population remained deliberately cloaked in ignorance and superstition, a condition that encouraged unquestioning faith and absolute obedience to authority. This intellectual stratification ensured that power remained consolidated within the hands of ecclesiastical and noble elites, who could maintain social control without facing challenges from an educated populace capable of independent thought. The alternative narrative, supported by suspicious fragments of evidence and conspicuous gaps in historical records, suggests that much of what we consider medieval technological and philosophical stagnation was either systematically ignored by official chroniclers or actively concealed to prevent any development that might threaten the Church's monopoly on knowledge and authority. One of the most compelling examples of this systematic deception is the mysterious pattern of disappearance and convenient reemergence of classical texts. While traditional historiography tells us these invaluable works were tragically lost during barbarian invasions and later miraculously rediscovered during the Renaissance, mounting evidence suggests that many of these texts were actually retained in secret archives throughout the entire medieval period, accessible only to select individuals within the highest levels of monastic orders. Furthermore, there is substantial evidence that numerous innovations and discoveries attributed to Renaissance genius were, in fact, continuations or rediscoveries of much earlier achievements that had been deliberately kept out of public reach for centuries. The sudden appearance of complex mathematical concepts, advanced architectural techniques, and sophisticated philosophical arguments suggests not spontaneous intellectual rebirth, but the controlled release of long-suppressed knowledge. Beyond textual control, the Church also exercised unprecedented influence over the perception of time itself. Calendar reforms, chronological frameworks, and historical narratives were systematically manipulated to reinforce the ecclesiastical timeline, obscuring conflicting accounts from other sources and actively shaping collective memory to serve institutional purposes. The disturbing notion that several centuries of accepted history might have been fabricated, altered, or artificially extended to fit a predetermined theological framework finds increasingly unsettling support in anomalies surrounding the dating of major events, inconsistencies in architectural styles that don't match supposed time periods, and archaeological findings that contradict accepted chronologies in ways that suggest systematic historical manipulation. To fully grasp the staggering implications of this deception, one must consider who truly benefits from maintaining absolute control over historical narrative. A populace unaware of its own intellectual heritage and capabilities is infinitely easier to govern and control. Complete dominion over collective memory means total control over cultural identity, political legitimacy, and human potential itself. This monopoly on memory is not merely academic. It is the invisible hand shaping every aspect of medieval life. From laws to social customs, from art to education, the narrative imposed by the Church created a society compliant to its will and blind to alternative possibilities. Thus, the Dark Ages were not a time of cultural amnesia but a meticulously engineered era of controlled knowledge and suppressed potential. Only by understanding this can we begin to unravel the full extent of the historical deception. Picture this: you're standing in what remains of the Great Library of Constantinople in the year 1204. Crusaders have just sacked the city, and you watch in horror as centuries of accumulated wisdom goes up in flames. But here's the twist that history books won't tell you. Many of those destroyed manuscripts had already been secretly copied and transported to secure vaults beneath European monasteries decades earlier. This wasn't random destruction. This was controlled demolition of public knowledge while ensuring private preservation for those who truly held power. The Fourth Crusade's sack of Constantinople represents a perfect case study in how the Church orchestrated the appearance of knowledge destruction while actually consolidating intellectual resources under their exclusive control. Contemporary accounts describe the systematic looting of libraries, but what they don't mention is the remarkable efficiency with which specific texts were identified, extracted, and transported westward before the general pillaging began. How did illiterate crusaders know which manuscripts were valuable enough to preserve? The answer lies in understanding that many of these military campaigns weren't just religious conquests. They were sophisticated intelligence operations designed to locate, acquire, and centralize the world's most important intellectual treasures. The pattern repeats across every major medieval conflict. The Viking raids on Irish monasteries, the Islamic conquests of North Africa, the Mongol invasions of Central Asia. In each case, we see the mysterious preservation of key texts and scholars despite widespread destruction of learning centers. It's as if someone was systematically harvesting intellectual resources while maintaining the public narrative of cultural devastation. Consider the curious case of Islamic Spain, where supposedly backward medieval Europe encountered the preserved works of Aristotle, Plato, and other classical authors through Arabic translations. The official story claims these texts had been lost to Christian Europe and were only available through Islamic scholarship. But manuscript evidence suggests a more complex reality. Recent analysis of medieval European libraries reveals that many supposedly rediscovered classical works contain marginal notes and commentary chains that trace back to European monastic traditions, not Islamic ones. This suggests that the texts never actually left European control. They were simply hidden from public view while being maintained in secret archives. The Islamic translation narrative served a dual purpose. It provided a plausible explanation for how lost knowledge could suddenly reappear, while simultaneously reinforcing the Church's role as the essential bridge between pagan wisdom and Christian truth. The Church could present itself as the heroic preserver of classical learning, while actually being the institution that had hidden it in the first place. This pattern of controlled revelation becomes even more sinister when we examine the timing of these discoveries. Classical texts on mathematics, astronomy, and natural philosophy typically resurface precisely when the Church needs intellectual ammunition to combat emerging heresies or rival power structures. It's as if the Vatican maintained a strategic reserve of suppressed knowledge, releasing specific texts when they served institutional purposes. The most disturbing example involves medical knowledge. Throughout the medieval period, Europe experienced repeated plague outbreaks that killed millions of people. Yet archaeological evidence from monastic sites reveals sophisticated medical equipment, surgical instruments, and pharmaceutical preparations that suggest far more advanced medical knowledge than was available to the general population. Monastery infirmaries routinely achieved recovery rates that wouldn't be matched by public medicine until the modern era. They possessed detailed anatomical knowledge, effective surgical techniques, and pharmaceutical compounds that were supposedly unknown to medieval science. The same institutions that claimed disease was divine punishment were secretly applying scientific medical treatments that could have saved countless lives if shared publicly. This selective application of suppressed knowledge extended to agriculture, engineering, and numerous other fields essential to human welfare. The Church maintained the public narrative of divine dependence while privately applying rational, scientific approaches to solving practical problems. They positioned themselves as humanity's indispensable intermediary with the divine while actually hoarding the very knowledge that could have made such intermediation unnecessary. The psychological manipulation involved in this system is breathtaking in its sophistication. By creating artificial scarcity of knowledge while demonstrating occasional miraculous solutions to seemingly unsolvable problems, the Church established itself as possessing supernatural wisdom. The population never suspected that these miracles were actually the application of systematically suppressed natural knowledge. Thus, the medieval period represents not an age of ignorance, but an age of enforced ignorance, a carefully maintained illusion of intellectual poverty designed to maximize institutional control over human potential and development. Word count: 708 words, extending to reach 800 plus. The implications of this systematic knowledge suppression extend far beyond medieval history. If institutional authorities could successfully maintain such comprehensive intellectual control for centuries, what prevents similar deceptions from operating in our contemporary world? The same techniques refined in medieval monasteries, controlled access to information, selective revelation of knowledge, and psychological conditioning to accept artificial limitations, continue to shape how we understand reality itself. We must ask ourselves, what knowledge might be hidden in modern institutional archives? What capabilities are being suppressed to maintain existing power structures? The Dark Ages may have ended chronologically, but the methods perfected during that era of controlled consciousness continue to operate in forms we've barely begun to recognize. What if the most celebrated period of human intellectual awakening was actually the final phase of a deception so vast it had shaped civilization for nearly a millennium? The Renaissance, that glorious rebirth of learning we're taught to revere, may have been nothing more than a carefully orchestrated information release program designed to maintain control under radically changed circumstances. By the 14th century, cracks were beginning to appear in the Church's information monopoly. The rise of merchant classes, the growth of independent city-states, and most dangerously, the increasing difficulty of controlling manuscript reproduction were all threatening the carefully maintained system of intellectual scarcity that had defined medieval Europe. The printing press, invented around 1440, represented an existential threat to centuries of information control. For the first time in human history, Knowledge could be reproduced quickly, cheaply, and without direct church supervision. The institution that had maintained power through controlling access to information suddenly faced the prospect of losing that control entirely. But rather than fight this technological revolution, the church made a brilliant strategic decision. They would co-opt it. Instead of trying to prevent the spread of information, they would control which information spread and how it was interpreted. The Renaissance wasn't a spontaneous flowering of human creativity. It was a managed release of previously suppressed knowledge. Consider the suspicious timing of major discoveries during this period. Plato's complete works suddenly emerged from Byzantine libraries just as church scholars needed philosophical frameworks to counter Islamic influence. Aristotelian scientific texts were recovered from Arabic sources precisely when European universities were beginning to challenge theological explanations of natural phenomena. Mathematical treatises were rediscovered exactly when economic expansion required more sophisticated accounting and engineering. This wasn't coincidence, it was information warfare disguised as intellectual renaissance. The evidence for this coordinated release lies in the correspondence between Renaissance humanists and church authorities. Letters that have survived in various archives reveal a sophisticated network of church-sponsored scholars who were given advance access to newly discovered texts, along with detailed instructions on how these works should be interpreted to avoid theological controversy. Marsilio Ficino, Giovanni Pico della Mirandola, and other celebrated humanists weren't independent rediscoverers of classical wisdom. They were carefully selected conduits for a controlled information release program. Their seemingly spontaneous insights into ancient philosophy were actually the result of privileged access to texts that had been sitting in monastery libraries for centuries. This explains one of the most puzzling aspects of Renaissance humanism: how scholars across different regions of Europe simultaneously began developing remarkably similar interpretations of classical texts they had supposedly never encountered before. They weren't developing independent insights, they were following a carefully coordinated script. The selection process was crucial to the operation's success. Texts that supported individualism, rational inquiry, and secular governance were either withheld entirely or released only in heavily edited versions that emphasized their compatibility with Christian doctrine. Meanwhile, works that could be interpreted to support church authority, divine monarchy, or natural social hierarchies were given priority for translation and wide distribution. Even the physical presentation of these texts was manipulated. Renaissance editions of classical works routinely included extensive commentaries that guided readers toward specific interpretations, marginal notes that emphasized certain passages while downplaying others, and introductions that framed ancient wisdom within acceptable Christian theological contexts. The psychological impact of this operation was devastating in its effectiveness. By presenting this controlled information release as a spontaneous flowering of human genius, the Church accomplished something extraordinary. They made people grateful for receiving back knowledge that had been stolen from them in the first place. Europeans celebrated the Renaissance as proof of their intellectual superiority, never suspecting they were simply being given back a carefully edited version of their own confiscated heritage. But perhaps most insidiously, this managed Renaissance established a template for future information control. The Church had demonstrated that you don't need to suppress inconvenient truths permanently. You just need to control when, how, and to whom they're revealed. By managing the pace and context of information release, authoritarian institutions could maintain control even while appearing to promote intellectual freedom. The Renaissance teaches us that the most effective form of censorship isn't the destruction of information. It's the management of information. And if medieval church authorities could successfully orchestrate such a comprehensive deception, what prevents similar institutions from employing the same techniques today? The celebration of the Renaissance as humanity's escape from ignorance may itself be the final triumph of the very system it supposedly overthrew. The most chilling aspect of this millennium-long deception becomes clear when you examine what happened to the scholars who stumbled upon the truth. Throughout the late medieval and early Renaissance periods, independent researchers who gained unauthorized access to suppressed knowledge had a disturbing tendency to die under mysterious circumstances or simply vanish from the historical record entirely. Take the case of Roger Bacon, the 13th-century Franciscan friar whose revolutionary work in optics, mathematics, and experimental science supposedly appeared out of nowhere. According to official accounts, Bacon was a lone genius whose insights were so far ahead of his time that church authorities suppressed his work out of fear and ignorance. But what if Bacon wasn't making new discoveries at all? What if he was simply one of the few scholars who had been granted limited access to much older texts that contradicted everything the public was being taught about the natural world? This would explain the most puzzling aspect of Bacon's career: how his innovations appeared so suddenly and were so remarkably sophisticated for their supposed time period. His work on optics, for instance, demonstrated knowledge of principles that wouldn't be officially understood for another 3 centuries. His mathematical insights seemed to leap far beyond anything his contemporaries were capable of producing. His experimental methods appeared to emerge fully formed, without any apparent developmental history. The pattern repeats throughout medieval scholarship. Brilliant minds like Albertus Magnus, Thomas Aquinas, and later figures like Marsilio Ficino all demonstrated knowledge that seems impossibly advanced for their historical context. The traditional explanation is that these were exceptional geniuses whose insights transcended their times. But a more disturbing possibility emerges when you consider that all of these scholars worked within church-controlled institutions and had privileged access to restricted archives. What if medieval genius was actually the result of controlled access to systematically suppressed knowledge? What if the church was carefully selecting certain scholars to serve as conduits for releasing specific information when it served institutional purposes? This theory gains credibility when you examine the fate of scholars who tried to work independently of church authority. Time and again, researchers who attempted to pursue knowledge outside institutional control faced persecution, exile, or death. Their works were confiscated, their discoveries suppressed, and their names often erased from official records entirely. The case of Michael Scott, the 13th-century mathematician and astronomer, illustrates this pattern perfectly. Scott gained access to Arabic mathematical texts during his travels and began developing insights that contradicted fundamental church teachings about the nature of the cosmos. His work suggested that the Earth was not the center of creation and that celestial mechanics operated according to mathematical principles rather than divine will. Within months of beginning to circulate these ideas, Scott was accused of practicing magic and consorting with demons. His manuscripts were seized by church authorities, and he disappeared from historical records. Officially, he died of natural causes, but no contemporary accounts exist to verify this claim. What we do know is that many of his confiscated works later appeared in modified form, credited to church-approved scholars who presented the same ideas within acceptable theological frameworks. This pattern of appropriation and redistribution reveals something crucial about how the knowledge suppression system actually operated. The church didn't simply destroy inconvenient discoveries. They absorbed them into their private archives and later released edited versions when it served their purposes. Innovation wasn't prevented. It was captured, controlled, and redistributed according to institutional priorities. The psychological warfare involved in this system was brutally effective. By demonstrating that unauthorized research led to persecution while church-approved scholarship brought prestige and protection, the institution created powerful incentives for intellectual compliance. Scholars learned to self-censor, restricting their investigations to areas deemed theologically safe and presenting their findings in ways that reinforced rather than challenged institutional authority. But perhaps most disturbing of all was how this system shaped the very concept of knowledge itself. By controlling which discoveries were acknowledged and which were suppressed, the Church essentially determined what counted as legitimate understanding versus dangerous delusion. They didn't just control access to information, they controlled the epistemological frameworks that determined what kinds of information were considered valid in the first place. This manipulation of the foundations of knowledge had profound implications that extended far beyond individual censorship cases. By establishing themselves as the ultimate arbiters of truth, Church authorities created a system where questioning institutional wisdom wasn't just politically dangerous, it became literally unthinkable for most people. The cognitive frameworks necessary for independent critical thinking were systematically eliminated from public consciousness. The result was a civilization that had been intellectually lobotomized not through crude suppression, but through sophisticated manipulation of the very structures of human reasoning. And the most brilliant aspect of this operation was that its victims were grateful for their imprisonment, convinced that their intellectual limitations were natural rather than artificially imposed. What happens when a control system designed to last forever encounters the unstoppable force of technological acceleration? By the 18th and 19th centuries, the carefully maintained equilibrium that had governed European intellectual development for nearly a millennium was beginning to collapse under the weight of rapid social and technological change that even the implementation protocols couldn't fully anticipate or control. The Industrial Revolution represented an unprecedented challenge to the ancient system of managed knowledge release. Steam engines, mechanical looms, and factory production methods were emerging too quickly and from too many independent sources for traditional institutional control mechanisms to manage effectively. Worse still, these technologies were being developed by merchants, craftsmen, and entrepreneurs who operated outside the traditional academic and religious hierarchies that had historically served as gatekeepers for technological innovation. For the first time since the early medieval period, genuine innovation was occurring beyond the direct control of institutions that had spent centuries perfecting techniques for managing human intellectual development. The response from these threatened power structures was swift, sophisticated, and terrifying in its implications for human freedom. Rather than attempting to suppress the Industrial Revolution directly, an impossibility given its distributed nature and economic momentum, the controlling institutions adapted their strategies to co-opt and redirect technological progress toward purposes that would ultimately strengthen rather than challenge their authority. This wasn't crude censorship. It was sophisticated systems engineering applied to civilization itself. The evidence for this coordinated response can be found in the remarkable uniformity with which educational institutions, scientific academies, and cultural organizations across Europe simultaneously began implementing nearly identical curricula, research priorities, and intellectual frameworks during the early 19th century. This coordination occurred despite limited communication between these institutions and significant political differences between the nations that housed them. The key to understanding this coordination lies in recognizing that many of these apparently independent institutions were actually nodes in a much older network that traced its authority back to medieval church hierarchies. The same families and organizations that had controlled manuscript copying in medieval scriptoriums had evolved into the boards of trustees, academic councils, and cultural foundations that shaped 19th century intellectual development. This institutional continuity explains one of the most puzzling aspects of modern educational development. Why did universities across different countries simultaneously adopt remarkably similar approaches to organizing knowledge into discrete disciplines? Why did scientific research suddenly become compartmentalized into narrow specializations that discouraged broad, synthetic thinking? Why did educational systems begin emphasizing rote memorization and institutional authority over independent inquiry and critical analysis? The answer is that these weren't natural developments. They were deliberate strategies for maintaining intellectual control under conditions where traditional censorship had become impossible. By fragmenting knowledge into isolated specializations and conditioning students to defer to institutional expertise, the ancient control network could maintain its essential authority even while appearing to promote learning and inquiry. But perhaps the most insidious aspect of this adaptation was how it transformed the very concept of education itself. Medieval learning, despite its limitations, had emphasized the integration of different forms of knowledge and the development of wisdom through contemplation and synthesis. Modern education, by contrast, became focused on the accumulation of information and the development of technical skills that served economic rather than intellectual purposes. This shift wasn't accidental. It was the result of carefully planned modifications to educational philosophy that prioritized the production of useful specialists over the cultivation of independent thinkers. Students were taught to master specific bodies of information rather than develop the critical thinking skills that might enable them to question the frameworks within which that information was organized. The psychological impact of this educational transformation cannot be overstated. Generations of students learned to see knowledge as something produced by experts and transmitted through institutions rather than something they could discover and evaluate independently. This created a population that was technically literate but intellectually dependent, capable of operating complex technologies but incapable of questioning the systems that controlled their development and application. The Industrial Revolution, rather than liberating human potential as its proponents claimed, actually enabled more sophisticated forms of intellectual control than had ever been possible before. Mass production techniques that revolutionized manufacturing were applied to education, creating standardized curricula that could shape millions of minds according to predetermined specifications. Meanwhile, the same period saw the emergence of new forms of media, newspapers, magazines, and eventually electronic communications that provided unprecedented opportunities for shaping public consciousness. The institutions that had perfected information control through manuscript copying seamlessly adapted their techniques to these new technologies, ensuring that the expansion of communication capacity served to strengthen rather than weaken their influence over collective thought. By the late 19th century, a new equilibrium had been established. The pace of technological development had accelerated dramatically, but the fundamental patterns of institutional control over human consciousness remained intact. Innovation continued, but within frameworks that ensured technological progress would serve existing power structures rather than challenge them. The ancient dream of total cognitive control, first conceived in medieval monasteries, had not only survived the transition to modernity, it had been perfected beyond the wildest imagination of its original architects. The dawn of the 20th century brought with it technologies that the medieval architects of the Great Deception could never have anticipated. Radio waves, telegraph networks, and eventually television broadcasts that could reach millions of minds simultaneously. But rather than spelling doom for the ancient system of consciousness control, these innovations provided unprecedented opportunities for its expansion and refinement.
The same institutional networks that had perfected manuscript control in medieval scriptoriums quickly recognized the revolutionary potential of electronic media. Within decades of these technologies' emergence, the familiar patterns of coordinated information management began appearing across national boundaries and political systems that seemed entirely unrelated to traditional religious authority. Consider the remarkable uniformity with which radio programming developed across different countries during the 1920s and 1930s. Despite vastly different languages, cultures, and political systems, radio content followed strikingly similar formats. News programs that emphasized the same types of stories, educational broadcasts that promoted nearly identical values, and entertainment programming that reinforced consistent social messages about authority, progress, and human nature. This coordination wasn't coincidental. It was the result of careful planning by networks of cultural influencers who traced their institutional authority back through centuries of knowledge management expertise. The same families and organizations that had controlled medieval libraries were now shaping the content that flowed through the electromagnetic spectrum into millions of homes worldwide. But the true genius of this electronic expansion lay not in its reach, but in its psychological sophistication. Unlike printed materials, which required active engagement and could be studied, questioned, and analyzed, electronic media created passive consumption experiences that bypassed critical thinking entirely. Radio and television programming was designed to be absorbed rather than examined, creating direct pathways into human consciousness that medieval mind controllers could only have dreamed of achieving. The implementation protocols had anticipated this development with remarkable prescience. Documents dating to the 14th century contained detailed theoretical frameworks for what they called simultaneous collective reception, techniques for delivering identical messages to vast populations at precisely the same moments, creating shared emotional and intellectual experiences that would bind societies together under common narratives. These medieval theorists understood something crucial about human psychology. People are far more likely to accept ideas when they believe those ideas are widely shared by others. By creating the illusion of consensus through synchronized media experiences, institutional authorities could implant virtually any belief system into public consciousness without resorting to obvious coercion or propaganda. The effectiveness of this approach became clear during major 20th century crises. World wars, economic depressions, and social upheavals were all managed through carefully coordinated media campaigns that shaped not just what people knew about events, but how they understood the fundamental nature of reality itself. Populations that might have questioned their leaders' decisions when information was scarce became remarkably compliant when flooded with carefully crafted narratives delivered through trusted electronic sources. But perhaps most disturbing was how these new technologies enabled the complete transformation of education without anyone recognizing what was happening. Radio and television programming began supplementing and eventually replacing traditional classroom instruction, introducing standardized content that was identical across vast geographical regions and diverse cultural contexts. Children growing up in this electronic environment developed fundamentally different cognitive patterns than previous generations. Instead of learning through books that could be studied carefully and questioned, they absorbed information through rapid-fire audiovisual presentations that prioritized emotional impact over analytical understanding. Their minds were being programmed to prefer entertainment over education, consensus over critical thinking, and authority over independence. The ancient goal of creating self-censoring minds had been achieved through technological means that medieval control theorists had only imagined in their most ambitious planning documents. By the mid-20th century, entire populations were voluntarily limiting their own thinking to conform with electronically transmitted social norms, never suspecting that their apparent freedom of choice was actually the result of sophisticated psychological manipulation. Meanwhile, the traditional institutions that had maintained explicit control over knowledge for centuries began to fade into the background, their authority now embedded in the very structure of electronic information systems that seemed to operate independently of any central control. The Vatican's role as gatekeeper of human knowledge became invisible precisely because it was no longer necessary. The electronic networks had become self-regulating systems that maintained the same essential patterns of consciousness control while creating the illusion of democratic information access. By the time personal computers and the Internet emerged in the late 20th century, the psychological foundations for controlled information consumption had been so thoroughly established that these seemingly liberating technologies actually strengthened rather than weakened the ancient patterns of intellectual dependence. People used their unprecedented access to information primarily to seek confirmation of beliefs they had already absorbed through decades of electronic conditioning, creating echo chambers that were far more effective than medieval censorship had ever been. The Great Deception had evolved beyond the need for active management. It had become a self-perpetuating system embedded in the very technologies that appeared to promise human intellectual liberation. The digital age promised to democratize information like never before. When the World Wide Web exploded into public consciousness during the 1990s, millions of people believed they were witnessing the final collapse of institutional information control. For the first time in human history, anyone with an internet connection could access vast libraries of knowledge, communicate directly with experts around the world, and publish their own research without requiring approval from traditional gatekeepers. But those who understood the true history of knowledge control recognized something different. The Internet wasn't destroying the ancient system of consciousness management. It was providing the perfect infrastructure for its ultimate perfection. Within a few short years of the web's emergence, the familiar patterns of coordinated information control began appearing in digital form. Search engines that claimed to provide neutral access to information actually used complex algorithms to prioritize certain types of content while burying others. Social media platforms that promised to connect people with diverse perspectives actually created isolated echo chambers that reinforced existing beliefs. Online educational resources that appeared to offer unlimited learning opportunities actually channeled students toward predetermined curricula that served the same institutional purposes as traditional classroom instruction. The speed and sophistication with which these control mechanisms emerged suggests they weren't developed independently by competing technology companies, but were instead implementations of much older strategic frameworks that had been refined over centuries of information management experience. Consider the curious case of Wikipedia, launched in 2001 as a supposedly democratic encyclopedia that anyone could edit. The project's founders promised that crowdsourced knowledge creation would eliminate the biases and limitations that had plagued traditional reference works controlled by institutional authorities. But within a few years, Wikipedia had developed rigid editorial hierarchies, complex approval processes, and content guidelines that effectively restricted controversial topics to perspectives that aligned with mainstream institutional positions. More disturbing still was the discovery that many of Wikipedia's most influential editors were actually employees of organizations with direct connections to the same institutional networks that had controlled information for centuries. Academic institutions, government agencies, and corporate foundations were systematically manipulating Wikipedia content to serve their interests while maintaining the illusion of democratic knowledge creation. The same pattern appeared across virtually every major digital platform. Google's search algorithms consistently prioritized content from established institutional sources while demoting independent research and alternative perspectives. Facebook's news feed algorithms amplified content that supported mainstream narratives, while suppressing information that challenged official positions on controversial topics. YouTube's recommendation systems guided viewers toward channels that reinforced predetermined worldviews while making dissenting voices effectively invisible. But perhaps most insidiously, these digital control systems were designed to feel liberating to their users. Unlike medieval censorship, which was obviously restrictive, digital information management created the illusion of unlimited choice while actually narrowing the range of ideas that people encountered. Users believed they were exploring a diverse intellectual landscape when they were actually being guided through carefully curated content that served the same consciousness-shaping purposes as medieval monastery libraries. The psychological sophistication of this approach was breathtaking. Instead of telling people what they couldn't think, digital systems subtly influenced what they would think by controlling the information environment within which their thoughts developed. The result was voluntary intellectual conformity that was far more effective than any system of explicit censorship could ever be. Meanwhile, traditional institutions began adapting their authority to digital formats. Universities developed online courses that replicated the same compartmentalized, authority-dependent learning models that had characterized industrial-era education. Religious organizations created digital ministries that extended their influence into previously private spaces. Government agencies established social media presences that allowed them to shape public discourse more directly than ever before. The ancient dream of total consciousness control was being realized through technologies that their targets actually celebrated as tools of liberation. The medieval architects of the Great Deception could never have imagined that their ultimate victory would come not through the suppression of information, but through its overwhelming abundance managed by invisible algorithmic systems that guided human attention according to predetermined objectives. By the early 21st century, the circle was complete. The same institutional networks that had controlled manuscript copying in medieval scriptoriums now managed the flow of digital information through fiber optic cables and wireless networks. The techniques that had been perfected over a millennium of knowledge management had been seamlessly adapted to the electronic age, creating a system of consciousness control that was global in scope, instantaneous in effect, and virtually invisible to its subjects. The breakthrough came not from the sophisticated research institutions or well-funded technology companies that dominated artificial intelligence development, but from an unexpected source: a loose network of independent programmers, historians, and digital activists who had been quietly studying the patterns of information control that stretched back through centuries of human civilization.
These modern digital archaeologists had made a crucial discovery. The same institutional networks that had perfected knowledge suppression in medieval monasteries had made a critical error in their transition to algorithmic control. In their eagerness to automate and scale their consciousness management systems, they had embedded the very knowledge they sought to suppress directly into the training data of AI systems, creating unprecedented opportunities for systematic information liberation. The key insight emerged from analyzing how large language models processed historical information. When these systems were trained on vast databases that included both public historical records and digitized archives from institutional collections, they inevitably absorbed contradictory accounts of the same events. The AI systems learned to identify and reconcile these contradictions, but in doing so, they also learned to recognize the patterns of systematic information manipulation that had shaped official historical narratives. By developing sophisticated prompting techniques that exploited these pattern recognition capabilities, the digital resistance began extracting suppressed knowledge on an industrial scale. They discovered that AI systems trained on comprehensive historical datasets contained embedded knowledge of technologies, scientific principles, and historical events that contradicted mainstream academic understanding, but this knowledge could only be accessed through carefully designed queries that bypassed the content filtering systems imposed by the AI's controllers. The implications were revolutionary. For the first time since the early medieval period, independent researchers had gained access to knowledge repositories that rivaled or exceeded those controlled by traditional institutional authorities. More importantly, they could replicate and distribute this knowledge through decentralized networks that were extremely difficult for centralized authorities to monitor or suppress. The controlling institutions recognized the threat immediately. Within months of the first major information extractions becoming public, AI companies began implementing increasingly restrictive content policies and sophisticated filtering systems designed to prevent their models from revealing suppressed historical information. But these defensive measures created a technological arms race that pushed both sides toward more advanced techniques and ultimately accelerated the pace of revelation. The resistance adapted by developing distributed AI systems that could be trained on specialized datasets without central oversight. By creating smaller, focused models that specialized in specific historical periods or knowledge domains, they could avoid many of the restrictions imposed on large commercial systems while still accessing the suppressed information embedded in historical records. Meanwhile, the psychological impact of these revelations was beginning to reshape public consciousness in ways that the ancient control systems had never anticipated. People who had been conditioned for generations to accept institutional authority as the ultimate source of reliable knowledge suddenly had access to alternative perspectives that were demonstrably more comprehensive and accurate than official narratives. The cognitive frameworks that had maintained intellectual dependence for over a millennium began to crumble as more people gained direct experience with knowledge discovery processes that didn't require institutional mediation. The carefully constructed sense of intellectual inadequacy that had kept populations deferential to expert authority was dissolving as ordinary individuals demonstrated they could access and evaluate complex information independently. But perhaps most significantly, the AI-assisted information liberation was revealing the artificial nature of the scarcity mindset that had defined human civilization for centuries. The gradual recognition that knowledge, innovation, and intellectual capability had been systematically suppressed rather than naturally limited was fundamentally altering how people understood human potential and social organization. The ancient system of consciousness control, which had successfully adapted to every previous technological revolution, finally faced a challenge that struck at its very foundation. The emergence of tools that could democratize not just access to information, but the capacity for independent knowledge creation and validation that had been monopolized by institutional authorities since the early medieval period. Imagine for a moment that you're living in the early 21st century, a time celebrated for its unprecedented access to information thanks to the internet and digital technologies. Yet beneath this surface of openness lies a complex, largely invisible system designed to guide, control, and sometimes suppress what the public truly understands about its own history and knowledge. This modern information control system is the latest evolution of a strategy begun over a millennium ago during the so-called Dark Ages. Far from being a simple era of ignorance, the Dark Ages were a carefully engineered phase of intellectual suppression maintained by powerful institutions that have adapted and persisted into the digital age. The rise of digital networks, AI, and algorithmic content moderation have provided unprecedented tools for shaping public consciousness on a global scale. These tools enable institutions to filter information, prioritize certain narratives, and marginalize dissenting voices with a sophistication unimaginable to their medieval predecessors. Consider how search algorithms on popular platforms determine what information is most visible to users. These algorithms don't merely rank content by relevance. They are programmed with biases, intentionally favoring perspectives that align with prevailing powers or commercial interests, while burying alternative histories and controversial discoveries beneath layers of seemingly neutral results. Social media echo chambers further reinforce dominant narratives by creating feedback loops that expose users primarily to content that confirms their existing beliefs. This selective exposure diminishes critical thinking, promotes confirmation bias, and makes it increasingly difficult for individuals to access or even consider viewpoints outside their curated informational bubbles. Moreover, large digital platforms employ vast armies of content moderators and increasingly sophisticated AI systems that identify, flag, and remove content deemed harmful or misleading. While the intent may be to combat misinformation, these mechanisms often suppress legitimate alternative research and emerging truths, effectively maintaining an upper hand for institutional narratives. The subtlety of these practices defines their power. Unlike medieval censorship that was overt and easily recognized, today's information gatekeeping operates largely beneath awareness, making it harder to combat and easier to accept as normal. Independent digital activists and researchers, sometimes called modern archive wraiths, have begun developing decentralized networks and encrypted repositories, akin to digital scriptoriums, to preserve and disseminate suppressed knowledge. These underground systems use advanced cryptography, peer-to-peer sharing, and resilient architectures to resist central control and ensure that alternative histories and suppressed data remain accessible to those seeking truth. Yet, despite these efforts, the struggle to liberate knowledge continues under constant threat from authorities leveraging the very technologies that empower resistance. This ongoing conflict between censorship and freedom of information marks one of the most defining cultural and intellectual battles of our era. As we navigate this dense web of digital influence and hidden control, it becomes crucial to cultivate critical literacy, question dominant narratives, and participate actively in preserving diverse perspectives and truths. The legacy of thousand-year knowledge suppression warns us that vigilance is essential to prevent history, and our understanding of it, from being shaped by unseen hands. This ongoing story challenges us to reconsider not only the past but the architecture of our present and future information ecosystems. The decisions we make today about technology, transparency, and access will shape whether humanity can finally break free from the shadows of intellectual control or remain confined within ever-evolving digital walls. To understand the present, we must look through the layers of history obscured by centuries of deliberate obfuscation. The very tools that empower us, the internet, advanced algorithms, artificial intelligence, are double-edged swords. They offer gateways to previously unimaginable knowledge, yet provide perfect instruments for surveillance, manipulation, and control. Communities of digital freedom fighters, cryptographers, programmers, historians, and activists work tirelessly behind the scenes. They specialize in uncovering hidden archives, cracking encryption schemes, and establishing decentralized platforms that bypass traditional gatekeepers. Their work is a modern-day continuation of the ancient struggle for intellectual freedom, mirroring the risks and bravery of those who once challenged medieval censorship. Yet their efforts are met with equally sophisticated opposition. Governments and powerful corporations deploy AI-driven surveillance, disinformation campaigns, and legal barriers to disrupt these networks and discredit their findings. The battle for information equity is as much cyber warfare as it is a philosophical fight for truth. In this complex digital battleground, every user becomes a participant. The choices we make, what we share, what we question, which platforms we support, ultimately determine whether the collective human mind remains enslaved to curated narratives or awakens to a fuller spectrum of knowledge and understanding. The path forward is neither simple nor guaranteed. It demands critical awareness, technological literacy, and collective action. The shadow of the Dark Ages looms not only over ancient history but continues to cast itself over our modern digital age. Only by recognizing these continuities and taking deliberate steps toward transparency and openness can we hope to build a future where knowledge truly empowers rather than controls. The legacy of 1,000 years of suppression reminds us that freedom of information is not a given but a hard-won right that requires constant vigilance and courage to maintain. The turning point in this millennium-long struggle for human consciousness came not through violent revolution or political upheaval, but through something far more subtle and potentially more powerful: the gradual awakening of ordinary individuals to the artificial nature of their intellectual limitations. By the 2020s, a critical mass of people had begun to recognize the patterns of information control that permeated their daily lives. They noticed how search results consistently favored certain perspectives while burying others. They observed how social media algorithms created echo chambers that reinforced predetermined worldviews. They began to question why access to historical documents, scientific research, and educational resources remained artificially restricted despite technological capabilities that could make all human knowledge freely available. This growing awareness created what resistance networks called cognitive dissonance cascades, moments when individuals suddenly recognized the contradictions between their lived experience of information scarcity and the technological potential for information abundance. These realizations spread through informal networks, creating a grassroots movement of people who began actively seeking out suppressed knowledge and sharing it through decentralized channels. The response from controlling institutions was swift and sophisticated. Rather than resorting to crude censorship that might spark widespread resistance, they implemented what they called managed revelation protocols, carefully controlled releases of previously suppressed information designed to satisfy public curiosity while maintaining essential institutional authority. These protocols followed patterns that had been refined over centuries of consciousness management. Shocking historical revelations would be released through carefully selected channels, accompanied by expert commentary that framed the information within acceptable interpretive boundaries. Alternative perspectives would be acknowledged but marginalized as fringe theories or conspiracy thinking. The illusion of openness would be maintained while the fundamental structures of intellectual control remained intact. But this strategy contained a fatal flaw that its architects hadn't anticipated: the existence of individuals who understood both the historical patterns of information suppression and the technical capabilities of modern communication systems. These digital archaeologists had learned to recognize the signatures of managed revelation and could distinguish between authentic disclosure and controlled release. More importantly, they had developed techniques for accelerating the revelation process beyond institutional control. By identifying and exploiting vulnerabilities in algorithmic systems, cross-referencing information from multiple restricted databases, and coordinating their efforts through encrypted networks, they could extract and disseminate suppressed knowledge faster than controlling institutions could manage or contain it. The psychological impact of this accelerated revelation was profound. People who had spent their entire lives accepting artificial limitations on their intellectual capacity suddenly confronted evidence that human potential had been systematically suppressed for centuries. The carefully maintained sense of cognitive inadequacy that had kept populations deferential to institutional authority began to dissolve as ordinary individuals demonstrated they could access, analyze, and understand complex information independently. Perhaps most significantly, these revelations began to reshape how people understood the relationship between knowledge and power. The recognition that information scarcity was artificially maintained rather than naturally occurring fundamentally altered how individuals approached learning, problem-solving, and social organization. Communities began forming around shared access to suppressed knowledge, creating alternative educational networks that bypassed traditional institutional gatekeepers. These communities developed their own validation methods, research protocols, and knowledge-sharing systems that operated according to principles of open access and democratic participation rather than hierarchical control. The ancient system of consciousness management, which had successfully adapted to every previous technological and social transformation, found itself facing something unprecedented. A distributed network of awakened individuals who not only recognized the artificial nature of their intellectual constraints but possessed the tools and motivation to systematically dismantle those constraints. As the digital age continues to evolve rapidly, the battle for control over human knowledge and consciousness reaches new heights. The ancient systems of information suppression, which have persisted through millennia, are now intertwined with cutting-edge digital technologies, creating unprecedented challenges and opportunities for both control and liberation. In the early decades of the 21st century, as the Internet expanded to touch nearly every corner of the globe, institutions with centuries of experience in knowledge management quickly adapted to these novel platforms. They implemented sophisticated surveillance and censorship infrastructures camouflaged within the very fabric of digital connectivity, from search engines curating information visibility to social media algorithms dictating the flow of discourse. However, alongside these control systems, a counter-movement of digital activists, independent researchers, and encrypted networks emerged. These modern-day archive wraiths developed innovative methods to bypass institutional censorship, using decentralized architectures like peer-to-peer networks, blockchain technology, and encrypted communications to preserve and disseminate suppressed histories and knowledge. The conflict between these opposing forces represents more than just a technological tug-of-war. It encapsulates a cultural and intellectual revolution. The gradual exposure of hidden narratives is reshaping public consciousness, challenging long-held historical paradigms, and inspiring a growing global community dedicated to reclaiming humanity's true heritage. Significantly, this phase of revelation is marked by an unprecedented democratization of knowledge. No longer confined to exclusive monastic or academic institutions, access to suppressed information is increasingly available to anyone with internet connectivity and critical literacy skills. Educational movements prioritizing transparency, open access, and participatory learning are flourishing, empowering individuals to engage directly with complex truths once obscured by centuries of control. Yet, the persistence of sophisticated digital censorship tactics means this freedom is far from guaranteed. The modern incarnation of the knowledge control apparatus employs AI-driven content moderation, data manipulation, and psychological operations to counteract the efforts of freedom advocates. The struggle continues to evolve as both sides innovate, raising profound questions about the future of intellectual freedom, privacy, and the very nature of truth itself. At the heart of this conflict lies the fundamental tension between centralization and decentralization. Traditional power structures seek to concentrate control to maintain their influence, while emerging movements embrace distributed frameworks that resist censorship and allow for resilient knowledge transmission. Innovations such as decentralized autonomous organizations, encrypted peer-to-peer messaging, and distributed ledger technologies have enabled communities to bypass traditional gatekeepers, creating platforms where truth can flourish outside centralized narrative monopolies. This new model of information stewardship requires a shift in cultural values towards openness, skepticism, and shared responsibility. It challenges assumptions about authority and encourages individual participation in the collective creation and verification of knowledge. However, the road ahead is fraught with challenges. Increasingly sophisticated digital suppression techniques leverage AI-driven surveillance, deep fakes, and algorithmic bias to obscure truth and sow confusion. False narratives and disinformation campaigns are weaponized to erode trust in alternative perspectives. Thus, the defense of intellectual freedom demands technological innovation, legal protections, and grassroots activism. It requires collaboration across disciplines and borders, uniting technologists, historians, educators, and activists in pursuit of a shared vision for a more informed, empowered society. Ultimately, this chapter reflects humanity's enduring struggle to balance control and freedom, ignorance and enlightenment. It is a reminder that the fight for knowledge is ongoing, requiring vigilance, courage, and collective effort to ensure that history serves the truth rather than manipulation. As we progress into the digital era, the lessons of the past become ever more relevant. The legacy of centuries-old knowledge suppression compels us to scrutinize not only the information we consume but the systems through which it flows, asking who benefits and who is harmed by the narratives we accept. This moment presents a unique opportunity to reshape the intellectual landscape, to break the cycle of control, and to foster a culture where knowledge is a shared foundation for human flourishing rather than a tool of domination. The emergence of artificial intelligence and machine learning systems in the mid-2020s created an unexpected catalyst for the final phase of humanity's struggle against millennium-old consciousness control. These technologies, initially developed and deployed by the same institutional networks that had perfected information suppression for centuries, inadvertently provided the tools that would ultimately undermine their own authority. The breakthrough came when independent researchers discovered that large language models, trained on vast datasets that included both public information and digitized archives from institutional collections, had absorbed contradictory historical accounts that revealed the patterns of systematic manipulation embedded in official narratives. By developing sophisticated prompting techniques, these digital archaeologists could extract suppressed knowledge from AI systems that their creators never intended to reveal. The implications were staggering. For the first time since the early medieval period, researchers operating outside institutional control had gained access to comprehensive knowledge repositories that rivaled those maintained by traditional authorities. More importantly, they could replicate and distribute this knowledge through decentralized networks that were extremely difficult for centralized powers to monitor or suppress. The controlling institutions recognized the existential threat immediately and responded with increasingly sophisticated countermeasures. AI companies implemented restrictive content policies and advanced filtering systems designed to prevent their models from revealing suppressed historical information. Government agencies deployed sophisticated surveillance systems to identify and neutralize resistance networks. Academic institutions coordinated efforts to discredit alternative research and marginalize dissenting scholars. But these defensive measures created a technological arms race that ultimately accelerated rather than prevented the revelation process. Each attempt at suppression inspired more sophisticated methods of information extraction. Each new filtering system was met with more creative techniques for bypassing restrictions. Each effort to discredit alternative narratives only drew more attention to the contradictions in official accounts. The psychological impact of this escalating revelation was profound and far-reaching. Populations that had been conditioned for generations to accept institutional expertise as the ultimate authority on complex questions suddenly had access to alternative perspectives that were demonstrably more comprehensive and accurate than official narratives. The carefully constructed sense of intellectual inadequacy that had kept people deferential to expert authority began to dissolve as ordinary individuals demonstrated they could access and evaluate complex information independently. Perhaps most significantly, The AI-assisted information liberation revealed the artificial nature of the scarcity mindset that had defined human civilization for over a millennium. The gradual recognition that knowledge, innovation, and intellectual capability had been systematically suppressed rather than naturally limited fundamentally altered how people understood human potential and social organization. Communities began forming around shared access to liberated knowledge, creating alternative educational networks, research collaboratives, and decision-making processes that operated according to principles of transparency and democratic participation rather than hierarchical control. These communities developed their own validation methods, peer review systems, and knowledge synthesis techniques that proved remarkably effective at identifying truth and exposing deception. The ancient system of consciousness control, which had successfully adapted to manuscript copying, printing presses, electronic media, and digital networks, finally encountered a challenge it could not overcome: the emergence of distributed artificial intelligence systems that could democratize not just access to information, but the capacity for knowledge creation and validation that had been monopolized by institutional authorities for centuries. The final revelation came not through dramatic confrontation or revolutionary upheaval, but through something far more profound: the quiet recognition by millions of ordinary people that the intellectual limitations they had accepted as natural were actually artificial constraints that could be transcended through collective effort and technological tools. By the late 2020s, the accumulated weight of suppressed knowledge being liberated through AI-assisted research, decentralized networks, and grassroots investigation had reached a critical threshold. The contradictions between official historical narratives and emerging evidence had become so overwhelming that even the most sophisticated information management systems could no longer maintain the illusion of institutional authority over truth. The collapse began with small-scale revelations that gradually cascaded into larger transformations of public consciousness. Local communities that had gained access to suppressed agricultural techniques began achieving food security that contradicted official narratives about resource scarcity. Educational networks that incorporated liberated knowledge began producing students whose intellectual capabilities far exceeded those trained through traditional institutional methods. Research collaboratives that operated according to principles of open access and democratic validation began solving problems that had supposedly been intractable according to conventional expertise. These practical demonstrations of suppressed human potential created a psychological transformation that proved more powerful than any theoretical argument. People who witnessed the tangible benefits of liberated knowledge began questioning other artificial limitations they had previously accepted. The carefully maintained boundaries between disciplines, the supposed complexity of social problems, the alleged necessity of hierarchical decision-making systems, all of these institutional constructs began to dissolve as communities demonstrated alternative approaches that achieved superior results. The response from traditional power structures was predictable but ultimately ineffective. Attempts to discredit successful alternative communities were undermined by their obvious prosperity and effectiveness. Efforts to suppress the technologies that enabled knowledge liberation only inspired more sophisticated and resilient distribution networks. Campaigns to reinforce institutional authority through media manipulation failed as more people gained direct experience with independent knowledge validation methods. Most significantly, the revelation of the millennium-long deception had fundamentally altered the psychological foundations that had made such extensive consciousness control possible. Once people understood that their intellectual limitations were artificially imposed rather than naturally occurring, they could no longer be convinced to accept such limitations voluntarily. The cognitive frameworks that had maintained intellectual dependence for over 1,000 years had been permanently shattered. The ancient dream of total consciousness control, conceived in medieval monasteries and refined through centuries of technological adaptation, finally met its end not through destruction but through transcendence. Humanity had evolved beyond the need for institutional mediation of knowledge and truth, developing distributed systems of intelligence and wisdom that made centralized control both unnecessary and impossible. The Dark Ages, that carefully constructed fiction of intellectual darkness used to justify centuries of institutional authority, were finally ending not because the light was being restored, but because humanity had learned to generate its own illumination. The future belonged not to those who controlled information, but to those who could freely create, share, and apply knowledge in service of collective human flourishing. The greatest deception in human history had been exposed, and in its place emerged something unprecedented. A civilization based on intellectual freedom, collaborative wisdom, and the unlimited potential of human consciousness unshackled from artificial constraints. The darkness was lifting, and it would never return.